So a few months ago, I went to Cardiff and took a look around the 5 most dangerous areas according to official police statistics and some other data. You can watch that video after this by clicking the link at the top of the screen now if you haven't seen it. I thought the areas I went to were pretty shocking, honestly. The stats were off the charts. There was an insane amount of litter and junk everywhere, and the areas were clearly run down. But the interesting thing to come out of it was the amount of comments and the feedback I got from locals saying that those were not the worst areas in Cardiff. And most of you listed the areas that you think are the worst areas. So I listened, I reached out, I chatted with a few of you, and I went back to Cardiff and checked out the 5 areas that you all most commonly told me were actually the most dangerous and the worst areas to live in Cardiff. I would love to hear what you think about this one and what you see coming up in this video. And thanks to HelloFresh for sponsoring this video. I have an offer to share with you later on, so stay tuned for that. Okay, so I'm going to kick off this list with Ely, which is an estate and a community located to the far west of Cardiff. This area was mentioned by a bunch of you guys in the comments, and I can see why. It's statistically the most deprived area in Cardiff, and it also has a pretty high crime rate. Not high enough to make the top 5 highest crime areas covered last video, but still, there's nothing to be proud about having a crime rate of 140, as that is still not far off being twice the national average. If you're looking into places to live in Cardiff, I'd still go as far as to say that Ely is or can be a dangerous place, and it's not somewhere you'd want to move to, and it certainly has a long history of making headlines for all the wrong reasons. One example being that it was only last year that riots broke out after 2 teenagers were tragically killed when they crashed their e-bike while being followed by the police. Now, I understand the gravity of an incident like this, of course, and why the residents felt the way I did. But as you can see from this news footage here, this is a community that is willing to escalate to serious levels of violence. More than 30 locals were charged with offences relating to the riots, which included cars being smashed and burned out, houses were damaged, a number of police and residents were injured. And at the end of the day, it's only the community that suffers more from an incident like this. I walked past the site of the crash, and there is still a memorial, as you can see here. But moving on, as you can see from the footage, Ely isn't trying to hide the fact that it's struggling. It didn't really matter which road I walked down and which way I turned. There was always either litter, bulky items dumped, signs of drug use, dilapidated buildings, or a combination of all of the above. I'm not sure what that means or what this road used to be called, but it's probably not good. To further this point, because I know that I'll get some comments saying that I have it all wrong and how Ely is one of the best areas to live, etc. The BBC published a bunch of stats recently showing Ely as having the highest percentage of free school meals across Wales, the 7th highest proportion of long-term sick and disabled residents. Unemployment is around 10%, which is twice the city average, and 39% of those have never worked a day in their lives. And 28% of children in Ely are living in poverty. These stats speak volumes. We live in sad times, and Ely is one of the many areas taking the brunt of it. Obviously, I visit a lot of areas like this, but I don't know, walking around Ely on this day and taking into account that it's not even anywhere near the worst area in Cardiff, I had one of those what the heck has happened to the UK moments, like really. On the crime side of things, we're talking serious organised crime gangs operated in the area. There are Class A drug dealers, serious assaults, murders, and even gun crime. Some of the reports I read are not for the faint-hearted, I'll say that. I'm not sure it'd make me feel any safer, but there is a police station here. However, let's be honest, it doesn't look very welcoming. It looks more like the police have occupied the derelict building themselves and fortified the ground floor, doesn't it? I could have captured hours of footage like this. Almost every road, there are boarded up windows or doors, piles of junk everywhere, and I lost count of the number of white goods and black dumped all over the place. So seeing as a bunch of you guys, locals, recommended this area and told me that it's one of the worst areas in Cardiff, I'd love to hear your thoughts as to why. And on that note, if you're thinking of moving into the area, according to Rightmove, the average price for properties sold over Ely in the last year was in the 205,000 range. Next, we have Grangetown, which is located to the south of Cardiff. This area has an interesting mix of tourist attractions down at the bay, signs of gentrification and industrial development, alongside filth and serious crime and poverty issues in most of the estates. So according to a bunch of comments on my last Cardiff video, it's nicknamed Grangetown by locals, as well as being called a cesspit, dump and some harsher words that I don't want to repeat. So to give you a flavour for the area, Wikipedia describes Grangetown as a diverse and multicultural district with a significant population of Somali, Asian and mixed race residents. This is very obvious from walking around the area, as you'll be able to see from some of the footage. As I mentioned, Grangetown is yet another area within Cardiff that's struggling with poverty. The Welsh Index of Multiple Deprivations has identified 4 areas within Grangetown as being among the most deprived neighbourhoods in the whole of Wales. And that's quite an achievement, I guess. This house is pretty wild. I've read some news reports about it. It's an old boy who's upset about his neighbour's extension and home improvements. He's had signs up for a couple of years like this apparently, but I think the less said about it, the better. Grangetown isn't that far behind Ely in terms of crime stats. It has a published crime rate of 136. That means there are 136 crimes per 1,000 population reported every month. That's pretty darn high, and in such a densely populated area comprising mostly of flats and terrace housing, as you can see here, that's a lot going on in the underbelly of Grangetown. Like, for example, this wild story last year where a guy was kidnapped by a gang and they tortured him while trying to get $100,000 ransom. Drug dealers are scooped up on a regular basis in this area, as you'd expect. I mean, if you Google stabbing in Grangetown or something like that, you get pages of results. It's quite worrying, really. And there have been some tragic murders over the years, which of course is always sad to see. Walking around, it's more of the same of what I saw in the other 9 areas I've now been to in Cardiff. Bulky items dumped everywhere for the collection fairies to magically pick up. Litter all over the place that looks like it hasn't been touched in years. Discarded drug paraphernalia where kids play and families live. And you can tell a lot about an area by how heavily fortified the places of worship are, right? I'm not trying to show off, but where I live, these buildings don't have barbed wire, metal mesh covering all the windows and warnings of CCTV on every wall. This car looks like it's been there since the 1930s. On a positive note, if there is one, if you're a football fan, you can live a 5-minute walk away from the Cardiff City FC football stadium. But let's be honest, that's more likely to be a reason not to live in Grangetown if you don't already have enough reasons. And on that note, if you're thinking about moving into Grangetown, according to Rightmove, the average house price in the last year was in the 220,000 range. There is lots of development going on just over the River Taff there. And look at this, some residents that won't give you a hard time, unless you're carrying a loaf of bread, I guess. I want to take a moment out here to talk about HelloFresh, who have kindly sponsored this video. HelloFresh is a subscription meal service with more than 100 recipes to choose from, covering just about every world cuisine you can think of. Now, if you haven't used HelloFresh before, you get to make delicious meals at home and feel like a professional chef in the process. But it's the time and money savings that make it a no-brainer for me. After selecting the meals you want on their website, you get the exact pre-portioned ingredients with instruction cards delivered right to your door. As you can see here, I made the house favourite here of beef, pork and bean chilli. I even had time to make my own guacamole, as everything for the chilli was already measured out. All I needed to do was add the ingredients at the right time, which is something that even I can't get wrong. And here comes the really good news. The kind folks at HelloFresh have set up a very generous offer for you guys, the viewers of the channel. If you scan the QR code you see on the screen right now, you'll get 60% off your first box, 20% off the next 2 months, and free desserts for life. That's an amazing offer. Alternatively, you can click the link in the description below and use the code UNIQUEEXPLORED. Next, I popped over to an area called St Mellons, which is on the far east of the city, or more specifically, Old St Mellons, which is on the Trowbridge side. Because according to people who live there, like this guy, old and new St Mellons are very different from one another, so I don't want to paint the whole of St Mellons with the same brush. This guy even went as far as to say that the further you go into Trowbridge, or Mordor as he calls it, the rougher it is. So the reason St Mellons wasn't on my last video is because on paper it has a crime rate of just 110, which is still pretty high, but in the scheme of dangerous areas it's pretty low. Now obviously crime rates only tell part of the story, I know that, but I had to run with the data. But according to the comments I received, and I also spoke to a couple of viewers directly, St Mellons is known as one of the most dangerous areas in Cardiff. Even ET here was so surprised he wasn't on the last video, he called me out for being too scared to go there. Well, I went there, and you guys were right. I started out at Trowbridge shops, where there is also conveniently a bookies, of course. There was crazy amounts of litter with beer cans and drug needles mixed in, some big items dumped around the road, and the graffiti on this wall is just comical. Someone has taken the effort to black out the F word, but left the other part. Walking around the estates, there were just endless blocks of these types of flats for the most part. Music was blaring out from many of them. I heard people shouting. A couple of people hung their heads out the windows to ask me what I'm doing. And just from looks, it's probably the most run-down looking area I saw on the day. The stats seem to back this up as well. In a report commissioned by the Building Communities Trust in Wales, St Mellons and Trowbridge are both on that list as separate areas, as well as Ely from earlier, and also Gurnus in Merthyr, an area that I did a separate video on recently, and I recommend watching that one. You can see a link at the top of the screen now, if I remember to put it in, and also in the description. I just want to say at this point that I sympathise first. Life is tough across many parts of the UK right now. I'm not here doing this to glorify it. I'm trying to raise awareness. You know, it's sad. And it shouldn't be as bad as it is. The UK has the 6th largest economy in the world. But anyway, back to St Mellons. This was probably the area where I started to feel the most uneasy, to be honest. Unlike a lot of channels I see on YouTube, I try not to feature people in my videos, especially children. So I'm not trying to cause reactions or exploit anyone. And it was my fault for being here late in the afternoon, but there were literally people, mostly kids, everywhere while I was walking around, and no one liked the fact that I was filming. There were also loads of kids on bikes, all in black with balaclavas. You know what I'm talking about, and no one wants to see those on the estates. Also, am I the only person here who saw a mobile vape shop for the first time? Some of the recent news to come out of this area, I mean, just this week someone had their head bashed in at the local Tesco's. Members of criminal gangs operating in the area were busted, but it's just a revolving door for more to step in. And as with most areas identified as being in poverty, drug-related offences are super common. For the privilege of living in St Mellons, you're looking at almost 250k on average according to Rightmove. I couldn't get the data for just the Trowbridge side that I went to, but I looked up some listings individually and there were some bargains on there, I'll say that much. Next we have an area called Splott, which is a little east of the city centre. And here we are, right back in the high crime rate numbers. Splott has a crime rate of 155, so it's one of the less desirable areas on paper, as well as according to locals. There probably isn't much hope for Splott improving either, as it borders Butetown and Adamstown, two of the high crime areas I covered in the last video. It's certainly a name that came up a lot in the comments, and I even had a resident who wants to remain anonymous that was quite passionately emailing me back and forth, telling me that he thinks it literally is the worst area in Cardiff. I don't know where I rank it personally or where you guys do, but it's certainly up there. Times are hard for the residents. Splott is the 12th most deprived area across the whole of Wales, and it's incredible to me that 42% of children here are living in poverty. Walking around, it's pretty depressing as you'd expect, and as you can see here, there is drink and drugs paraphernalia everywhere, loads of litter, bulky items of course, kids riding around on bikes in balaclavas, boarded up windows and so on. It even looks like the Salvation Army have closed up and moved on. They've asked people here to stop fly tipping on their doorstep, so of course people use it as an opportunity to just dump their stuff. Looking behind the crime numbers, there are some deep-rooted issues with organised crime gangs operating in the area. Of course assaults are common in various forms, as are drugs. So I actually read a bunch of recent police reports for the area, and there have been some really gnarly incidents in Splott this year. I saw some locals jump to the defense of Splott in the comment section of my last video. Maybe they're trolling and maybe I shouldn't give it the time, but I just want to say that even if you've lived here or a similar area without any issues, you'd have to be pretty desensitized or just have blinkers on to be blind to the seriousness of crimes that do go down in this area. It never feels good to have someone lay this stuff out and say that you live in a dangerous or poor area, right? I get that. But also, turning a blind eye is a sure way to make sure things are never going to improve. Anyway, it's not cheap living in Cardiff. The average house price for properties sold across Splott over the last year was in the 205,000 range. For my final stop, I took a good look around an area called Llanedryn. At least I think that's how it's pronounced. If someone wants to correct me, it's all good. So much like the other areas in this video, I received a bunch of comments saying that Llanedryn is one of the worst areas to live in Cardiff. I also did some of my own research online and I found plenty of people who either currently live there or have lived there in the past that also back this up. This person here actually said that they had to move out due to the volume of antisocial behaviour, such as having their tyres slashed and house egged. And this person seems to think it's the murder capital of Cardiff, but I couldn't confirm that. It's an interesting area, I'll say that. It's quite hilly, and there are loads of flats and affordable housing complexes. And I'm guessing this tower block here is the main feature now, as it underwent a multi-million-pound transformation a few years ago. But the antisocial problems and the increase in crime levels that high-rise buildings attract are well documented. And just a stone's throw away from this shopping complex, there are derelict buildings, there's litter everywhere, and some of the same obvious signs of the area struggling with poverty as the other areas I visited. It goes to show something that I've seen across the UK. You can't just throw some money at an area, especially when it's not attracting any new lifelines, and expect the greater area to improve. I couldn't get the same granular level of crime and poverty statistics on Llanedryn as I could with the other areas for some reason, but it's clearly a similar story. You can see for yourselves here it's a bit shabby, right? And I guess this is where the sofas come to hang out when they're no longer wanted. So looking at the crime news for Llanedryn, Wales has a most wanted list actually, and a few of their top suspects do have ties to the area. So if you live in the area, it might be worth checking out this list yourself to see if you recognise any of the people, maybe you bump into them down at the shops or at the pub. So there clearly are plenty of unsavoury characters in the area, and it does get a bit nasty after dark if you're hanging out in the wrong places. And like all of the areas struggling across Cardiff that I've covered, and the UK as a whole to be fair, drugs are common, which of course brings in a whole host of other problems. Llanedryn is the least expensive of the areas I've covered to live in, according to Rightmove. Average house prices in this area are in the 186,000 range. And that just about wraps up the list of the 5 worst areas to live in Cardiff, according to comments left by you, the awesome, trustworthy viewers of the channel, as well as a little extra research of my own. Hope you enjoyed it. As always, all comments, feedback and criticism is welcome. Thanks very much.